Imagine you are standing in your city on an ordinary Tuesday morning. People are commuting, schools are opening, everything feels normal. Then, without warning, the temperature on the street rises to several million degrees Celsius. Everything within a kilometer of the detonation point is vaporized. Not destroyed, vaporized. Within 30 minutes, thousands of individual fires across a 22-kilometer radius merge into a single firestorm 45 kilometers wide. Internal temperatures exceed 800 degrees Celsius. Surface winds exceed 320 kilometers per hour, pulling oxygen away from anyone still alive, including those sheltering underground in purpose-built blast shelters. According to the 1987 World Health Organization report on the effects of nuclear war, the number of people killed by such a firestorm would be 3 to 4 times greater than those killed by the initial blast itself. This is not a theoretical worst case. This is the documented, peer-reviewed consequence of a single 5-megaton warhead detonated over a populated area. Today, there are approximately 12,121 nuclear warheads on Earth. Their combined destructive capacity is equivalent to more than 146,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. The instinct is to treat nuclear conflict as a military event, a tragedy contained to specific combatant nations. The historical record dismantles that framing immediately. In Hiroshima in 1945, a single bomb destroyed 80% of the city's hospitals and killed most of its medical staff within seconds. The International Committee of the Red Cross has stated formally that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapon use are beyond the capacity of any state or international organization to address. Not difficult to address, beyond the capacity to address. That was one bomb. The realistic question for the 21st century is not whether nuclear conflict would be catastrophic, it is how quickly that catastrophe would stop being local and become planetary. Mainstream reporting on nuclear weapons focuses on the diplomatic layer. Who has what, which treaties are holding, what the latest arms control talks produced. Major outlets cover that layer accurately. What they rarely reach is the engineering and atmospheric science underneath it. A 2022 Rutgers University study published in Nature Food used advanced climate modeling to run crop yield projections under multiple nuclear exchange scenarios. The Office of Technology Assessment published detailed calculations of blast pressure and thermal radiation. The EMP Commission documented the cascade failure of national infrastructure under electromagnetic pulse. These are technical assessments produced for governments, and their conclusions are significantly more severe than the diplomatic framing suggests. Here is what those assessments found that rarely makes the headline. A nuclear conflict does not need to be full-scale to functionally end global civilization as it currently operates. The threshold for civilization-level consequences is far lower than most people assume. Even a regionally limited exchange, the scale now considered plausible under current military doctrine, triggers consequences that no national border can contain. The mechanism is not the blast itself, it is what the blast does to the atmosphere. To understand why, consider the 3 systems that modern civilization actually depends on. First, an electrical grid built around large, custom transformers that take years to manufacture and cannot be stockpiled. Second, a global food supply chain maintained by a small number of breadbasket nations exporting surplus calories to import-dependent regions across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And third, a climate stable enough to sustain a growing season in those breadbasket regions. Nuclear weapons are capable of disabling all 3 of these foundations simultaneously through completely different physical mechanisms. The single failure point that changes the entire analysis is not the blast radius of any individual weapon, it is soot. When a nuclear weapon incinerates an urban area, the resulting firestorm lofts massive quantities of black carbon into the stratosphere above the altitude where rainfall can remove it. That soot absorbs incoming sunlight, warms the upper atmosphere, and cools the Earth's surface below. The 2022 Rutgers study calculated the specific agricultural consequences at 6 different soot loading levels. In a full-scale US-Russia exchange, approximately 150 teragrams of soot injected into the stratosphere, a global average surface temperature drop of 14.8 degrees Celsius within 1 to 2 years, a 70% reduction in global precipitation, and a 90% collapse in calorie production from the world's major crops within 3 to 4 years. The study estimates that over 5 billion people would die of famine within 2 years. But here is the figure that reframes the entire conversation. A so-called limited regional exchange, India and Pakistan, just 100 Hiroshima-sized weapons would inject 5 teragrams of soot and reduce global caloric production by 7%. The Rutgers team describes that as the largest agricultural disruption ever recorded in human history. It would be sufficient to trigger export bans, collapse international food markets, and cause mass starvation in nations that never fired a single weapon and may have no knowledge of why their food supply has failed. The collapse unfolds in layers, and each layer accelerates the next. In the first minutes, blast and thermal effects are geographically local. Within hours, a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse begins disabling electrical infrastructure across an entire continent. The EMP Commission identified large power grid transformers as the primary failure point. They are irreplaceable within any useful time frame. Manufacturing lead times range from 18 months to 3 years under normal conditions. Without power, telecommunications fail. Without telecommunications, fuel logistics collapse. Without fuel, food transport stops. Within days, urban populations dependent on just-in-time supply chains face acute shortages of food and water. Hospital generators exhaust their reserves. Water treatment plants cease to function. Radiation survivors, their immune systems, already compromised by bone marrow destruction and T lymphocyte depletion, are now stranded in a medical environment with no functioning hospitals, no antibiotics, and no surgical capacity. In the background, across months, the stratospheric soot layer spreads globally. Growing seasons fail in the Northern Hemisphere. Grain exporting nations immediately ban exports to preserve domestic food supply. The 2 billion people who depend on imported food face a complete cut-off, regardless of whether their governments were involved in any aspect of the conflict. There are things this analysis cannot tell you with certainty. The precise soot injection depends on which cities are targeted and in what sequence. Infrastructure cascade rates depend on which systems have been hardened against EMP. Most civilian infrastructure has not been. The long-term radiation health burden will vary by wind patterns and geography. And the most important unknown, how close current doctrine actually brings us to a crossing of the threshold. Russia's Zapad-99 military exercise simulated limited nuclear strikes to terminate a conventional conflict on favorable terms. General John Hyten acknowledged in 2018 that the United States lacked proportional, low-yield response options, meaning the only answers to a limited nuclear provocation were massive retaliation or standing down. The W-76-2 warhead was developed specifically to close that gap. More rungs on the deterrence ladder means more opportunities for a crisis to climb them, and more points at which a miscalculation becomes irreversible. Pull back from the individual mechanisms, and the conclusion is consistent across every independent technical source. The Office of Technology Assessment, the World Health Organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the EMP Commission, and the Rutgers Climate Team. A nuclear conflict at any meaningful scale does not produce a military outcome that can be geographically contained. It produces a planetary, biological, and civilizational event. The warheads do not need to reach your country for your country to be fatally affected. Soot carries no passport. The food supply chain has no war exemption clause. Every nuclear near-miss in history has produced exactly one useful output: a rule, a protocol, or an institution that did not exist before. Hiroshima produced the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Cuban Missile Crisis produced the Moscow-Washington Hotline and the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The 1983 Able Archer exercise, when Soviet early warning systems nearly triggered a launch in response to a NATO training exercise, produced a classified recognition inside both governments that command and control was more fragile than publicly acknowledged. What the current era of simultaneous modernization across three nuclear powers has not yet produced is the institutional architecture adequate to a three-player deterrence environment. The Cold War's logic of mutual assured destruction held because it was a two-player game with symmetric stakes. As strategic theorist Martin Shubik documented in 1982, in a three-player game, no principle of rational decision-making can resolve whether to act first or wait. Individual rationality no longer guarantees collective stability. Russia, China, and the United States are all modernizing 100% of their forces simultaneously. The mathematical foundation that kept the Cold War from going hot no longer applies to the environment that now exists. The forensic lesson of every near miss and every doctrinal shift in the nuclear era is the same. The taboo holds until the architecture designed to support it breaks. The work of this century is to build architecture adequate to the world that actually exists, before the evidence of its inadequacy arrives in a form that cannot be analyzed, early mourned.